Colorado, 1886, there are some forms of silence that are not an absence of sound, but a presence of their own. They can fill a house better than furniture and press down on a man's shoulders with a weight heavier than any physical burden. Elias Thorne knew this weight. He carried it with him from the cold floorboards he stepped onto each morning to the worn saddle he cinched tight in the gray light of dawn. His ranch was nestled in a valley that cupped the last of the winter snows, long into the spring, a place of stark and lonely beauty. The land was his only real companion, its demands, a constant, predictable rhythm that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far down paths he no longer wished to travel. He was a man of 52 years, though the lines etched around his eyes and the silver at his temples spoke of more time than the calendar had counted. His house was too large for one man. Martha had designed it. Her drawings spread across the kitchen table a lifetime ago. She had wanted wide windows to let in the morning sun and a porch deep enough for 3 rocking chairs, one for him, one for her, and one for their son, Daniel. Now, only one chair was ever used. The other 2 sat still, gathering dust and memories, silent monuments to a life that had been promised and then withdrawn. The fever had taken them both in the same brutal week 8 years ago, and with them it had taken the sound from the house. Since then, Elias had lived a life of routine. He rose before the sun, made coffee that was always too strong, and shared a piece of dry bread with Gus, his old grizzled dog, whose loyalty was as steady and unquestioning as the northern star. They would walk the fence lines together, Elias with his tools and Gus with his nose to the ground, 2 solitary figures moving through a vast and indifferent landscape. Elias had stopped expecting things. He did not expect good weather, or a good price for his cattle, or a letter from his distant sister. Most of all, he had stopped expecting the feeling of home to ever return to his own house. It was just a place he slept, a shelter. The weight of its silence was the price he paid for that shelter. He had accepted the terms of the transaction long ago. One Tuesday, in late May, the routine was broken. Elias was on the porch, mending a bridle, the leather stiff and unyielding in his hands. Gus, lying at his feet, lifted his head with a low growl, his gaze fixed on the long dirt road that led up to the house. Elias followed the dog's stare. A figure was walking toward them. It was not a rider, which was unusual, and it was a woman, walking with a steady, determined pace, not the aimless shuffle of someone lost. He watched her approach, a strange feeling prickling at the back of his neck. Visitors were rare, and a woman walking alone was rarer still. She was not young, but not old either. Her dress was plain, clean, but mended in several places. She carried a small worn carpet bag. She did not falter as she drew closer, her eyes meeting his without shyness or apology. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked. Her voice was clear, without the tremor of exhaustion he might have expected. "I'm Elias Thorne," he said, his own voice rusty from disuse. He did not stand. "My name is Sarah Miller. I was told in town you might have need of some help, a housekeeper perhaps. I can cook, clean, mend. I know my way around a garden." She said it all as a statement of fact, a list of skills, not a plea for charity. Elias looked at her. Her hands were clasped around the handle of her bag. They were capable hands, not delicate. There was a directness in her gaze that he found unsettling. It was the gaze of someone who had seen hardship and had not been broken by it. "This is a working ranch, Mrs. Miller, not a townhouse." "It's Miss Miller," she corrected him gently, "and I was raised on a farm. I know what work is." He considered her for a long moment. The silence of the house behind him seemed to press forward, to make itself known. The thought of another person inside it, another voice, another presence felt like an intrusion. It was easier to be alone. It was safer, but there was also something in her posture, a quiet dignity that made turning her away feel like a cruelty he was not capable of. "I don't have much to pay," he said, testing her. "I'm not looking for much," she answered. "A room, meals, enough to be respectable. I can earn my keep." He grunted, a non-committal sound. He looked down at Gus, who had stopped growling and was now watching the woman with a quiet curiosity. The dog seemed to approve, and Elias trusted the dog's judgment more than his own. "There's a room upstairs," he said finally, gesturing with his head toward the front door. "It's small. You can start on a trial basis. We'll see how it goes." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said. It was not effusive. It was a simple, solid statement of gratitude. She walked up the steps, and as she passed him to enter the house, he caught the faint scent of soap and dust from the road. For the first time in 8 years, someone other than him had walked through that door. The silence inside seemed to shimmer for a moment, disturbed before settling again. He did not know then that it would never settle in the same way again. The trial basis began, and Elias watched. He was a man who learned about the world through observation, reading the mood of a horse by the flick of its ear, the coming of a storm by the color of the sky. He applied the same careful scrutiny to Sarah Miller. He expected noise, chatter, the kind of nervous energy that most people use to fill empty spaces. He was wrong. She was quiet, not a timid quiet, but a confident, self-contained quiet. She moved through the house with a soft efficiency, and the first change he noticed was the smell. When he came in from the evening chores, the house no longer smelled of dust and old wood. It smelled of baking bread, of soap, of stew simmering on the stove. These were the smells of Martha's time, and they struck him with a force that almost buckled his knees. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, his hand on the frame, feeling like a ghost in his own home. She did not ask him what he liked to eat. She simply cooked good, plain food and left a plate for him on the table. She cleaned the windows until the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating dust motes he hadn't seen in years. She took the curtains down, washed them in a tub out back until the water ran clear, and hung them back up. The house began to breathe again. One afternoon, he saw her from the barn, out by the small plot Martha had once used for a garden. It was overgrown with weeds, choked and forgotten. Sarah was on her hands and knees, pulling at the stubborn roots with a steady, relentless rhythm. She was not daunted by the scale of the task. She simply started at one corner and worked her way forward. He watched her for a long time, the sun beating down on her back, her movements economical and sure. She was not just cleaning his house, she was tending to it. She was bringing a neglected thing back to life. Her competence extended beyond the house. A few weeks after she arrived, he was struggling to replace a rotten post in the corral. The ground was hard, the post was heavy, and his shoulder ached with a familiar dull pain. He heard her approach, but did not turn around. "You need a better fulcrum," she said, her voice calm and even. He stopped, annoyed at the interruption. "I've been setting posts since before you were born, Miss Miller." "I know," she said. It was not an apology. "But if you use that shorter rock and angle the crowbar, you'll get more lift." He wanted to tell her to go back to the kitchen. He wanted to assert his authority over his own land. But he was a practical man, and he could see the simple physics in her suggestion. Grudgingly, he did as she said. The post lifted with a groan and settled perfectly into place. He did not thank her. He just grunted and began tamping the dirt around the base. She stood there for a moment, longer, then turned and walked back toward the house without another word. She had not needed his thanks. She had only wanted the job to be done right. The small gestures accumulated, each one a stone laid on a path he did not realize he was walking. He came in one day, soaked from a sudden downpour, and found a dry shirt laid out on his bed. He tore his hand on a piece of barbed wire, and that evening a small tin of salve appeared on the table next to his plate. He never asked for these things. They simply appeared, silent acts of care that asked for nothing in return. He found himself changing in small ways, too. He started taking his hat off when he entered the kitchen. He washed his hands at the pump before sitting down to eat. One morning, as he was making his coffee, he automatically reached for a second cup, filled it, and set it on the table for her. He only realized what he had done when she came into the room and saw it. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, and that was all. It was a conversation held without a single word. They were learning a new language together, a language of quiet actions. A trip to the general store in town became a public accounting. Mr. Henderson, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of local affairs was both a community service and a minor menace, leaned over the counter as Elias paid for flour and salt. "Heard you took on some help, Elias," he said, his eyes twinkling. "That Miller woman seems to be setting your place to rights." "She's a hard worker," Elias said, his voice flat, offering nothing more. "That she is," Henderson agreed, refusing to be deterred. "Jedediah Vance was in here yesterday. Mentioned he saw her in your wagon. Said it was a shame to see a fine-looking woman like that stuck out on a quiet ranch." Elias felt the muscle twitch in his jaw. Jedediah Vance was a man who owned the largest spread in the county, and acted as if that gave him ownership of everything else too. He was smooth and confident, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "What Miss Miller does is her own business," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He saw it for himself later that day. As they were loading supplies into the wagon, Vance rode up, tipping his expensive hat. He directed all his attention to Sarah. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice slick as oil, "it's a pleasure to see you in town. You must get lonely out at the Thorne place. I'm having a barn dance next Saturday. You should allow me to escort you." Sarah finished tying a sack of oats and turned to him. Her expression was perfectly polite. "That's a kind offer, Mr. Vance, but I'm not one for dances. Thank you all the same. A little fun would do you good," Vance pressed, not used to being refused. "I have all the occupation I need, thank you," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it had a core of steel. She turned her back to him and climbed onto the wagon seat, a clear and final dismissal. Vance's face soured for a moment before he rearranged it into his customary smile. He tipped his hat again, this time to Elias, a gesture that felt more like a challenge than a courtesy, and rode off. On the ride home, the silence in the wagon was different. It was charged with the unspoken events of the town. Elias wanted to say something to acknowledge her quiet defense of her own ground, but the words wouldn't come. He just drove the team, his eyes on the road, but his mind was on the woman sitting beside him. She had not needed him to defend her. She was perfectly capable of doing it herself. The realization settled in him with a surprising weight. He had thought he was providing her with shelter, but he was beginning to wonder if she wasn't the one sheltering him. "What country are you listening from today? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Drop it in the comments below. It means everything to me to know where this voice is reaching, to know that we're sharing this moment together, no matter the distance. Thank you for that." Now, let's get back to the story, because Elias is about to have a conversation that changes the way he understands his own life. The turning point came on a warm evening in early summer. The work was done, the sun was setting, and the sky was streaked with pink and orange. They were sitting on the porch, a habit they had fallen into. He was in his rocker, and she was on the top step, mending a tear in a grain sack. The rhythmic pull of her needle and thread was the only sound, aside from the chirping of the crickets. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. But tonight, Elias felt a restlessness stir within him. He felt the need to define what was happening, to put a name to this new rhythm of his life. "You've done good work here, Miss Miller," he began, his voice sounding loud in the quiet air. "More than I asked for. The place, it feels different." She did not look up from her sewing. She simply nodded. "It's a good place. It just needed some attention." He felt a familiar frustration with the inadequacy of his own words. He was trying to talk about the feeling of the house, the lifting of the oppressive weight, and she was talking about weeding a garden. "It's more than that," he insisted. She finished her stitch, bit the thread, and finally looked at him. Her eyes were clear in the fading light. "This place feels quiet in a good way," she said softly, "not an empty way." The words landed in the center of his chest with the force of a physical blow. In one simple sentence, she had perfectly described the change he had been unable to articulate. She understood. She had seen the difference between the sterile silence of absence and the peaceful quiet of contentment. She had looked into the heart of his lonely life and had not been afraid of what she saw. She had simply named it. He could not speak. He just stared at her. This woman who had walked up his road a few months ago, a stranger with a carpet bag, and who now seemed to understand him better than anyone had in years. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at her work, as if she had not just fundamentally altered the landscape of his world. For him, nothing would ever be the same. The porch, a place that had been his solitary perch for observing the world, now felt like a threshold. And he knew with a terrifying certainty that he had just crossed it. That night sleep would not come. Elias lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight casting pale rectangles on the opposite wall. Her words echoed in his mind. Quiet in a good way, not an empty way. He had lived with the empty way for so long he had forgotten there was any other kind of quiet. And with that realization came a flood of thoughts he had kept dammed up for years. He thought of Sarah, of her steady hands and her steady gaze. He thought of the way she moved with a purpose that seemed to come from deep inside her. He thought of the scent of baking bread in a house that had long forgotten it, and a feeling he could not name, a dangerous and unfamiliar warmth, began to spread through him. Then came the arithmetic. It was the cold, hard logic he had always used to protect himself. He was 52. He had looked in the small mirror by the wash basin that morning and had seen a man whose face was a map of hard years and lost joys. He was set in his ways, worn down, a creature of habit and silence. She was, what? Not yet 30, he guessed. She was a woman with a life still ahead of her. A life that should be filled with laughter and children and commotion, not the slow, quiet ticking of a clock in a lonely ranch house with an old man. It was not right. It was not sensible. What could he possibly offer her? A shared silence? The company of his ghosts? The town would talk. They would say he was a fool taking advantage of her situation. They would say she was a fool, wasting her youth on him. The arithmetic was simple, and the answer was clear. It could not work. It should not work. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden, as he thought of Martha. For 8 years, he had been faithful to her memory. He had kept her room as she had left it, her brush still on the dresser, a ribbon she had used as a bookmark still tucked into her favorite book. To even think of another woman in this house, in this life, felt like a profound betrayal. He had loved his wife. He still loved her. How could he even consider this? The warmth he had felt earlier curdled into a familiar sour ache. He had stopped expecting happiness for a reason. It was easier this way. It was safer. The next morning, he avoided her. He took his coffee and bread out to the barn, needing the familiar smells of hay and horse to ground him. He worked with a feverish intensity, repairing tack that didn't need repairing, cleaning stalls that were already clean. He was trying to outrun his own thoughts, but he could not escape her presence. From the barn doorway, he saw her. She was at the woodpile, splitting kindling for the stove. She swung the small axe with a clean, efficient motion, her body moving with a natural grace. There was no wasted effort. Each swing was precise, effective. She was not just strong, she was capable. She was a woman who knew how to survive, how to build, how to make a place for herself in the world. He watched her, and the cold arithmetic began to lose its power. He stopped counting the years that separated them and started seeing the qualities that defined her: steadiness, honesty, kindness, a resilience that was as beautiful and as unadorned as the landscape around them. He thought of Jedediah Vance, a man closer to her in age, with his wealth and his easy smiles. Vance saw her as something to be acquired, a pretty ornament for his prosperous life. He did not see her. He did not see the strength in her hands or the wisdom in her quiet. Elias realized he was counting the wrong things. Life was not an equation to be solved. It was not a ledger of years and assets. He had been so focused on the arithmetic of his loss, on the number of years he had been alone, that he had forgotten how to measure value. The value of a shared meal, the value of a mended shirt, the value of a quiet understanding that needed no words, the value of a house that felt like a home again. He left the barn and walked not toward the house, but toward the small, fenced-off plot on the hill where two simple wooden crosses stood. He had not been there in months. The grass was long, but Sarah had clearly been tending to it. The weeds were gone, and a small jar of wildflowers sat at the base of Martha's cross. The sight of it made his throat tighten. He stood before the graves, his hat in his hands. Gus sat beside him, leaning his solid weight against his leg. "Martha," he said, the name a strange and unfamiliar shape in his mouth. "Daniel." The wind whispered through the tall grass. He didn't know what he had come here to say. To ask for permission? For forgiveness? He looked at the wild flowers. Sarah had done this. She had tended to his grief as she had tended to his garden, quietly, without being asked, respecting the ground she was on. "She's a good woman," he said to the silent earth. "She makes the house feel right." He paused, searching for the truth. "I think you would have liked her." He said the words, and the world did not end. The guilt he had been bracing for did not come. Instead, there was only a profound sense of peace. He was not replacing Martha. He was honoring the life they had built by choosing not to let it crumble into dust. He was choosing to live again. He made his decision then, standing on that quiet hill. He would not be governed by the cold arithmetic of doubt. He would not let the fear of what people might say dictate the rest of his life. He was a fool, perhaps, but he would rather be a fool who reached for a chance at happiness than a wise man who died alone in a silent house. He turned away from the graves, a new resolve settling in him. He was going to walk across the field anyway. He was going to speak. He found her by the creek that ran along the edge of the property. She was washing clothes, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hands moving rhythmically in the soapy water. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwood trees, dappling the water with light. He stood for a moment, watching her, gathering the unfamiliar words. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She must have sensed him, because she looked up, her expression calm and questioning. She wiped her wet hands on her apron. He walked closer, stopping at the edge of the creek bank. He had rehearsed no speech. He only had the raw, honest truth of his own fear and his own hope. Sarah, he said. He had never used her first name before. It felt both strange and right. She waited, her eyes on his face. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he started, his voice rough. About you being here, about everything. He took a deep breath. A woman like you deserves better. The words came out, his greatest doubt laid bare. You deserve a younger man, a man who isn't so quiet. You deserve a house full of life, not a place full of memories of someone else's life. This isn't fair to you. He had said it. He had offered her an escape, a chance to choose a different path, the one that sensible arithmetic would demand. She looked at him, and for a long moment she said nothing. Her expression was unreadable. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He had been wrong. He had misread everything. He had made a fool of himself. He had finally broken the comfortable quiet between them with his clumsy, foolish words. Then she took a step toward him, crossing the small space that separated them. She looked up at him, and he saw a softness in her eyes he had never seen before, a gentle, unwavering light. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, steady. Elias, she whispered, her voice so soft he could barely hear it over the sound of the creek. I've been waiting for you. He stared at her, uncomprehending. Waiting for me? Not for you exactly, she clarified, a small smile touching her lips. I was waiting for a man like you. I've seen what better looks like, according to the world. I've seen men like Jedediah Vance. They offer shiny things, but they have no substance. They don't know what a home is. They only know what a house is. She looked around at the trees, the creek, the familiar landscape of his ranch. I haven't been waiting for a younger man, or a richer one. I've been waiting for a good one, a steady one. I've been waiting for a place that felt quiet in a good way. I've been waiting for a home. She looked back at him, her gaze direct and full of a feeling that stole the air from his lungs. I found it here. The trapped bird in his chest was suddenly still. All the arithmetic, all the doubt, all the fear, it all just fell away, washed clean by the simple, clear water of her words. He had offered her what he thought was his broken, lesser life, and she had seen it as the very thing she had been searching for. He didn't know what to do, so he just covered her hand with his own. His was rough and calloused, hers was damp from the creek, but the connection was the surest thing he had felt in 8 years. The next Saturday, they took the wagon into town. They did not go to the general store first. They went straight to the small house where Reverend Michael lived. He was a kind man with a gentle face, and he showed no surprise when Elias, his hat in his hands, explained why they had come. He simply invited them in, and in the quiet of his front parlor, with his wife as a witness, Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller were married. It was a simple ceremony. There were no flowers, no music, just the plain, solid words of the vows. When Elias had to say them, his voice was thick with an emotion he could not name. He looked at Sarah, and she was already looking at him, her hand steady in his, her face calm and certain. In that moment, he knew he had done the right thing. When they left the Reverend's house, the world looked different. The sun seemed brighter, the sky a deeper blue. As they walked to the general store, Mr. Henderson saw them from his doorway. He looked from Elias to Sarah, his gaze lingering on the way Elias held her arm. A slow smile spread across his face. He simply nodded once, a gesture of profound and silent approval. The community had rendered its verdict. It made sense. Jedediah Vance was there too, speaking with some other ranchers. He saw them, and his conversation faltered. His eyes narrowed for a second, taking in the new reality of the situation. Then he composed his features, tipped his hat in their direction, and turned his back. It was not an act of courtesy, but of concession. The ride home was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of two separate people sharing a space. It was the silence of a beginning, a shared quiet full of unspoken promises. When their wagon turned onto the long road to the ranch, Elias looked at the house waiting for them in the distance. For the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was truly going home. 2 years passed. The ranch thrived, as if the land itself felt the change. The fences were all mended, the barn had a new coat of paint, and the garden Sarah had reclaimed from the weeds was a riot of color and life, producing more vegetables than two people could ever eat. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with a different kind of sound now. It was the sound of a baby's laughter. Her name was Anna, and she had her mother's steady brown eyes and a tuft of dark hair like her father's. She was the sound the house had been missing for so long. Her small cries and happy gurgles filled all the empty spaces, chasing the last of the ghosts from the corners. One evening, Elias sat in his rocking chair on the porch. It was the same chair on the same porch, but the man sitting in it was not the same man. He was watching Sarah, who was sitting on the top step, just as she had been on that pivotal evening 2 years before. But now she was not mending a grain sack. She was holding Anna, humming a soft tune as the baby drifted to sleep in her arms. Gus, older and grayer now, lay at his feet, his tail thumping a slow, contented rhythm on the wooden planks. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same brilliant streaks of pink and orange. Elias looked at his wife and his daughter, and a feeling of such profound peace settled over him that it felt like a physical presence, a warm blanket covering him. He remembered the man who had sat here, a man who had stopped expecting anything but the turning of the seasons. He had been so sure he knew the shape of his life. He had been so wrong. Sarah looked up and saw him watching her. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew. She had always known. The quiet between them was still there, but now it was a rich and precious thing, the quiet of a shared life, a shared love, a shared home. He had not had to fight for this happiness. He only had to be brave enough to accept it when it walked up his road. And so we come to the heart of the matter. It is a story we see played out time and again in ways both large and small. It is the story of the difference between arithmetic and value. Elias Thorne was a man who was good at arithmetic. He could count his years, he could count his losses, he could calculate the odds and conclude, quite sensibly, that his time for happiness was over. His ledger was full of subtractions, and he saw no path to adding anything more. The numbers told him he was too old, too worn, too full of sorrow to begin again. The world, through voices like Jedediah Vance, agreed with this cold calculation, seeing only a mismatch of years and prospects. But Sarah Miller was not doing arithmetic. She was measuring value. She did not count a man's years. She measured his character. She did not assess his wealth. She assessed his steadiness. She saw the value in his quiet strength, the decency in his weary eyes, the goodness in the way he cared for his land and his dog. She was looking for a home, not a house, and she knew that a home is not built with numbers. It is built with respect, with kindness, and with a shared understanding that transcends words. She saw the value in a man who thought he had none left to offer. This story is a lesson in how we count. We can spend our lives counting our regrets, our mistakes, the years we have lost. We can let the cold arithmetic of the world tell us what is and is not possible, what we do and do not deserve. Or we can choose to count differently. We can count the small kindnesses, The moments of quiet connection, the strength of character we see in others. We can learn to see the true value of a person, which has nothing to do with their age or their station, and everything to do with the goodness in their heart. Elias believed a woman like Sarah deserved better because his arithmetic told him so. But Sarah knew the truth. Better is not a number. Better is a man who makes you feel safe. Better is a place that is quiet in a good way. Better is finding the person who was waiting for you, even if neither of you knew it. Thank you for your time and your attention. It is the greatest gift you can give, and I am truly grateful for it. It is your presence, your willingness to listen and share in these stories that keeps this channel, this small community, alive and thriving. I hope that wherever you are, you feel a measure of peace and that you remember to count the things that hold true value. Until next time, be well.